Hello, this is week 5 for us. It's the beginning of a new section of 4 weeks. We'll stay with this general theme, capture and lines of flight, then the prison and the camp. Okay, so we did in the previous 4 weeks, we dealt with the question of sovereign power and dialectical subversions, right? We started with a reading of central chapters from Hobbes's Leviathan, and then we saw Carl Schmitt, right, from the concept of the political and political theology. Then we went into Hegel's master and slave dialectic, and Marx. We saw the section on alienated or estranged labor from the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, and also the section called private property in communism. Okay, so today we start with a reading selections from these two books. One is this one, The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community by Maria Rosa Della Costa and Selma James, and the other is a chapter from Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch, the central chapter called The Great Caliban. Okay, so do the reading, right, according to what the syllabus says, and remember also that you have to do the writing assignments. Okay, do write your journal entry on Blackboard. Okay, again, you can use the options that I suggest in the syllabus, and also you find them on Blackboard, or any other problem theme that you find as you read these chapters, right? Or also, a few passages that you want to elaborate on. What I suggest is, one is, what is housework, right? The labor of care. Why is it right, traditionally called women's, in quote, women's work, right? What is its place in the community and in society? We will see, for example, the difference soon between a service and care, which are usually conflated into, become one and the same concept and practice, but they should be distinct. They are two completely different things. And option two would be, what is the difference between a subjected and a rebel body? This especially probably having to do with Federici's chapter from the Great Caliban, from Caliban and the Witch. In any case, if we begin perhaps with Dalla Costa and James, again, this is a chapter from, like I said, The Power of Women and the Subversion of the Community. And at the beginning, page 1, for you will see that there is this important emphasis precisely on domestic work, okay? And so they speak about this in relation to the capitalist relations of power or domination, and again, I had to be very sketchy, and just give a sense of, in broad outlines of the reading. The readings, so if you go to page 2, then there is this section beginning, which is also very important, the origins of the capitalist family. And then on page 5 and 6, page 5, the bottom of page 5, you have the beginning of this section called the exploitation of the wageless. And on page 5, for example, I read, we are dealing here at the top of page 5, we are dealing here with the revolt, they say, of those who have been excluded, who have been separated by the system of production, and who express in action their need to destroy the forces that stand in the way of their social existence, and so on. And then on page 8, you also find this idea of exploitation, the exploitation not only of the wageless, but also the exploitation of reproduction, and okay, for example, I read in the same way, this is a quote, as women are robbed of the possibility of developing their creative capacity, they are robbed of their sexual life, which has been transformed into a function for reproducing labor power. Okay, so this is also what is being exploited. Production and reproduction, think about this as well. And on page 8 and then 10, still the same um, topic. Okay, so they say on page 10 in a section called the productivity of wage slavery based on unwaged slavery. It is often asserted that within the definition of wage labor, women in domestic labor are not productive. In fact, precisely the opposite is true. Pay attention to this. This is very important, okay? The distinction between what capital, the capitalist logic, considers productive or unproductive work, labor, and also the usual, overlooking of the importance of reproduction, not only biological reproduction, but also reproduction, social reproduction of labor power, right? I mean, basically, when one works, then one right? One consumes one's energy, right? And this energy must be then reproduced, replenished, so that, right, so to speak, the day after one can work again, right? So in any case, all this takes effort, takes labor, takes time. This is part of production in a broad sense. But in any case, here specifically in relation to the question of women's so-called work, right? They say it is often asserted, I repeat the quote, which is very important, that within the definition of wage labor, women in domestic labor are not productive. Okay, so this is very central because domestic labor, domestic work, housework, so-called women's work, is usually considered not productive, unproductive. It is not acknowledged as work even, and let alone paid, right? So there is also, of course, in relation to these readings that we are doing, the important movement of wages for housework. Okay, you can check that as well online, but but the question is, okay, that this work, right, labor, this right, apparently, I mean, according to the logic, the ideology of capital, considered unproductive, is actually not only is it productive, reproductive, but it is not only is it useful, but it is essential, of course, for the flourishing, the continuity of communities, but it is completely overlooked. And so this means that there is a double exploitation of so-called women's work, okay? And and of course, this is addressed in a way, I mean, by Dell'Acosta and James, and in the feminist Marxist tradition, as something that must come to an end, and something that must be completely subverted. That's the idea, the subversion that we already saw, generally speaking. We saw the idea of subversion already with Hegel and Marx. But in any case, I hope that this is clear. Again, you do the reading. They say, Dell'Acosta and James say, now it is clear that not one of us believes that emancipation, right, they say, liberation can be achieved through work. right? So actually, work is something that we will see must stop. The sense of the type of this work, wage work, and so on. Then they will get into this very important idea. That again I invite you to really consider the refusal of work and the struggle not to work. Okay, which is, by the way, a very interesting question that we usually don't ask. Why work, right? To begin with, that's an interesting question already in itself. In any case, to go back to the quote that I was reading from page 11. Okay, I read this again. Now it is clear that not one of us believes that emancipation, liberation can be achieved through work. Work is still work, whether inside or outside the home. Okay, so I again also invite you to think about the meaning of work. Also, go back to Hegel's the pages from Hegel that we read, and especially Marx in the section on alienated labor. Okay. Um, otherwise, through work, we still remain within the problem, not the solution, they say, okay? And then there is something also very important on page 12. The whole essays, the whole chapter is very important. And for example, they say, and this is set in italics, the starting point is not how to do housework more efficiently, but how to find a place as protagonist in the struggle. There is not a higher productivity of domestic labor, but a higher subversiveness in the struggle. So the idea is to be able to precisely subvert, right, these relations of power, whereby there is such a great high degree of exploitation. In this particular case, it is the question of gender, right, which is very important in right society. And by the way, let me say that in a seminal work in the feminist tradition, feminist movement, a philosopher, Simone de Beauvoir, you can check this online, says the book is called The Second Sex, and in I believe toward the end of the 1940s was written, and she says, and think about this very important statement that seems paradoxical, but it is. So she says, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman, right? So that's very important. You can also think about this in general in relation to the things that we are going to see later in this section of the class. For example, the question of um, colonization, decolonization, slavery, the prison, and so on. So the idea, you can change, you can replace the word woman with any other social, category of a so-called identity, right? One is not born X, one becomes X. What that means, in so. In any case, they take issue with this question, of course, also of identity constructed by um, capitalist relations of production and power, relations of power. Okay, we are still within. I said last time, the question of power, sovereign power, will remain with us throughout this course. Okay. So they also call attention to the importance of a solidarity, a common solidarity, and it is on page 15 that you have the section called the refusal of work. Refusal of work. Now, I imagine for many of you, some of you certainly, this may be a new concept, but it is, a very important concept. There is a whole tradition, philosophical, political tradition speaking about this. But it is really important, right? Because wage labor is always, of course, highly, it has always a high degree of exploitation, and again, the question of work, as we already saw with Marx, right, always implies ultimately a loss of humanity and a loss of the self in the work. Okay, here there is of course a double exploitation of the wageless, of you know women working in, again, what is usually understood as problematically and wrongly, right, women's work. Okay, think about that as well. In think about this in relation of daily life, right? I mean, interpersonal relations and the way in which we live our life in the family, the community, and so on and so forth. Who does the essential work and who gets nothing, not even, let alone, again, the wage, but also very often a sense of acknowledgement that what one does is actually, work and so on. Okay. So, but what is important also, because this then will make us, on page 20, there is this section called the productivity of a discipline, right? Discipline is a concept that we will see again in Federici soon, and then as we move on in a couple of weeks, when we do, keep this in mind, Michel Foucault, uh, the book from sections from the book called Discipline and Power. This will come back, right, in important ways. And actually, what they say here on page 20, when they use the expression docile, D-O-C-I-L-E, docility, right? Docile workers producing, that's what, the system of capital and of the wage ultimately does. And this type of relations of productions and of power relations, ultimately there is this production of docility, right? Obedience, docile workers, okay? And therefore then they end with the idea of one section called Women and the Struggle Not to Work. I read one line from the top of this, from the beginning of this section. They say, summing up, let's sum up. They say, again, I quote, the role of a housewife, behind whose isolation is hidden social labor, must be destroyed. End of quote. Okay? So think about this. And but I want to, go from here to the other reading for today, okay? And again, I had to be sketchy but brief. But if you go to the chapter by Federici, the great Caliban, you see that the idea precisely of docility is problematized in similar ways, and it is here that then we see also the relation between the docile, obedient body and the rebel body that she highlights, and then this will come back again in with Foucault, Michel Foucault, like I said, but also, this links, ties back to also what we saw in terms of the dialectical subversions, okay? So in any case, it's interesting that at the beginning you will see of this chapter, The Great Caliban, there is the epigraph. One of the epigraphs that Federici uses is from Hobbes, from the introduction to the Leviathan that we saw that time. Back then was week 1. For us, we saw that, in class, in the face-to-face situation, right? I mean, the great introduction to Leviathan. You can go back and read that page that we read together. The chapter here in Federici, the chapter is called The Great Caliban, and the subtitle is The Struggle Against the Rebel Body. And she begins with actually a reference to Foucault that we will do as well, right? I mean, one of the preconditions, right, of I'm quoting from reading from the book, for a capitalist development was the process that Michel Foucault defined as the disciplining, right, of the body, which she says, Federici says, in my view, consisted of an attempt by state and church to transform the individual's powers, right, the powers of the any individual into labor power. Okay, so again, the idea that the docility, the obedience of the body is also a precondition for its utility, as Foucault says. Okay, so and she speaks of this idea that there is then emerging a new concept of the person. Okay, so uh, then pay attention also in this wonderful chapter. Look at the pictures. There are wonderful, impressive photos that you can also use to think about and elaborate on, write something about in your work, in your assignments. Okay, that's another way that you can also use this chapter. And then on page, for example, again, I had to be brief and sketchy. On page 137, there is this idea of repression, precisely, of the body, as we will see then with Foucault. This power is no longer only repressive, but also productive of a new, precisely, concept of the subject, the person, and so on. But for example, she says what is it, page 137, she speaks, this is line 3 from the top, right, precisely of this process of social engineering, right, whereby a new concept of the body comes about. Okay, so the new concept of the body precisely, which becomes a machine for a capital, as actually she will then say on page 146. This is an important moment that you can look at. It's set in italics at the bottom, page 146. She says, we can see, in other words, that the human body, and not the steam engine, and not even the clock, right, was the first machine developed by capitalism. Okay, so think about this. Again, this in a sense goes back also to what we saw in Hobbes, the body as a machine, although a machine of desire. In Hobbes, this desire is a desire for, of course, security and peace, and so we had the emergence of a sovereign power, the state, the law, and so on and so forth. But we can also have, and as we do in Federici, we can also see in this desire, of course, the desiring machine, right, the desire for autonomy, for ultimately rebellion, for something new, to bring about a new social order with new relations, right? So in any case, then she goes into, actually very interesting, on page 148 you will see the difference, distinction between Hobbes and Descartes, although we didn't do Descartes in this class. I mean, I do Descartes in modern philosophy, but maybe I spoke about him when we did Hobbes, right, during in our first meeting. But in any case, what Federici says is that there is, in basically, here there is the difference is that with Descartes, I'm sure you all heard the famous statement, I think, therefore I am. Everybody knows that. Maybe we don't know that that is Descartes, but that's Descartes. Okay, since we haven't studied Descartes per se, there is, okay, ultimately, I know that I'm oversimplifying this, but there is a passage from was she says in the model that we have from Descartes, the centralization of, I'm quoting, the functions of a command that in the same period was occurring at the level of the state, right? So, in other words, for Hobbes, you have the centrality of the state, right? Ordering everybody about, and then with Descartes we have also this kind of emergence of the idea of the sovereign individual, and but there are, there are so many important moments here that you will you will find so much to write about. Okay, actually it is here on page 150. Let me read this. Okay, I'm quoting toward the bottom of page 150. Federici says, against Hobbes, it was the Cartesian. Cartesian is the adjective for relating to Descartes, right? It was the Cartesian model that prevailed, right? The Cartesian model, whereby what Descartes does is he establishes the centrality of the self, the I think. Okay, for it expressed the already active tendency to democratize the mechanisms of a social discipline by attributing to the individual will, right? That function of a command, which in the model coming from Hobbes, right, the Hobbesian model, is left only, right, solely in the hands of the state. Okay, so we have this difference between the centrality of the state in Hobbes, the centrality of the individual will in Descartes. Okay, but ultimately it comes to the same type of control, a mechanism of control, as we will see. But and so there is then, of course, then there is this idea of and this taking issue, let's say, with the idea of individual identity, and therefore the possibility of thinking past this model and toward, again, like we saw already with Dalla Costa and James, the possibility of rebellion, right? So think about this. What is the difference, as I say in my suggestion for you to write, the difference between a subjected body, right, and a rebel body. I mean, a body that completely complies with laws that may be just, unjust, and so on and so forth, very often unjust, or the body that creates new space, new time, new situations, and a new ultimately idea, vision of life. The body that is, so to speak, at the threshold of something different. Okay, you can also think more generally about what the body is in relation to power. Okay, we saw the question of power already with right the first part of the class, but this is ultimately this is what the class is about. Okay, the question of power, political power, sovereign power, or the many variations to it, the modifications that we see today, and think about this also in light of what is going on today, the grim light of the pandemic, and again, what are we going to think in relation to this situation that globally may also bring about other problems, because one thing is the health crisis, created by precisely the emergence of the virus, right, coronavirus, and then the other is what is looming perhaps right now at the horizon, the possibility of also a social, political, as well as economic, right, crisis due to right the various situations of perhaps necessary lockdown and so on and so forth, stopping production and so on and so forth, but also the control of the body and what ultimately the body can do. Okay, I hope that this was uh, helpful. Again, make sure that you do your writing assignments, and next time we'll continue with right the second moment of this theme, this second section of the class, capture and lines of flight, and we'll speak briefly. We'll speak about colonialism and decolonization. Okay, all right. Thank you. Bye.